Hello! In this lesson we'll discuss about adding Google Analytics to your game. This will allow you to track and optimize user experience. You can get an idea of how the users are interacting with your game and what are the aspects that you can improve to increase the user engagement with it. In a previous lesson, when we created our AdMob ID, we also generated the app tracking ID for Google Analytics. This is the ID that we'll use to track our user interaction with our game. In case you didn't create a Google Analytics ID at that time, you can easily create one at any time from your Google Analytics account. And this is my Google Analytics account page. You can see that the ID generated by AdMob is the same as the one that I'm using in my Analytics account to check for the user's activity in my game. Right now, there are no records available in my account because the game does not implement Google Analytics tracking at this time. In order to be able to track the user interaction with my application or game, I will have to implement this into the game. To help us with this process, Google offers great support by describing the necessary steps in one of their developers page. So, before you begin, you need to make sure that you have the latest Android SDK installed. We already have that because we installed it in a previous lesson. Next step is to initialize the trackers. These are the objects that will keep track of our user presence and interaction with our app. And finally, we need to create at least one Google Analytics property and app view profile which will receive the data sent from our app. This is already created is the Analytics ID that AdMob has provided us when we created our banner ad. It's important to note that Google Analytics can be used on devices that do not have support for Google Play services. Google Analytics is using the Google Play Services library, which is already included in our project. Let's start with the first step. We need to update our Android manifest file. Then we initialize the trackers that we want to use and we create our configuration file for Google Analytics. There are many factors that you will be able to measure or track by using Google Analytics. These include but are not limited to application installations, active users and demographics, screens and users engagement, crashes, exceptions, and so on. Let's start by updating our Android manifest file. This file should include the permissions for accessing the internet and another optional permission to access the network state, so the application can check if the device is connected to the internet before passing the data to the Google servers. By opening the Android manifest.xml file, you can see that these permissions are already included in our app because these were also required by AdMob, so there's no need to add them anymore. Next step is to initialize the trackers. To make sure that the metrics are not overcounted, so we don't count a user activity multiple times, it is recommended that the tracker be created and managed in the application class. In our case, we don't have an application class, so we will need to create one. There are several trackers that can be implemented in our app, dealing with specific requirements. So, for example, we can implement an app tracker that will keep track of this particular app, global tracker that will track all of our apps, and an e-commerce tracker that will deal with the in-app purchasing or e-commerce category of our app. In our case, we will simplify this by using only one tracker. So I will copy these lines of code from this developer page and will paste them into my application class. But first we need to create this class. Back in Eclipse, I will right-click on the package name and will select New and then Class from the menu. For the class name, I will enter My App, but you are free to give it any name as you like. What is important to keep in mind is that our class will have to be a subclass of the Android application class. So we'll need to specify Android.app.application as a superclass for our newly created class. We'll click OK and our application class has been successfully created. Next, I will paste the code that I just copied earlier from the Google Developers page inside our class declaration. This code will declare 3 trackers that can be used in our application, although we will only be using one in this example. Next, we'll provide a method to return a requested tracker or create a new one if the requested one does not exist. This is called a singleton object and will make sure that at a given time, only one instance of our tracker exists. This will help us keeping the metrics to their real values but not overcounting a single user action. I will copy this code and will paste it after the hashmap declaration of my application class. This code works with all 3 trackers, so I will just modify it to suit my needs of using a single tracker. I will use the global tracker in this case. Next step is to create a configuration file for Google Analytics. This will be an XML file. The file will be stored in the res and then XML folder of our app, and its name will be global_tracker.xml. But first we need to create the XML folder in our resources folder. So I'll right click on the res folder and we'll select new and then folder from the menu. I'll name the folder XML. Then we need to create the file. Again, I will right click on the XML folder and will select new and then Android XML file. I will name the file global_tracker.xml and for the resource type I will choose values. It doesn't really matter what you choose here actually, because we'll overwrite the file content with the one copied from the Google page. We'll click finish and the file has been created. I don't know what I've done wrong, but the file has not been created in the XML folder as I wanted. Instead, it is located in the values folder. So I will drag and drop the file from the values to the XML folder. Great! Now that our file is placed into the correct folder, let's add some content to it. I will copy the text from the Google Developers page and will paste it into the newly created file by overwriting its content. Let's examine the content of this file. First, there is a GA_session_timeout element. This will define the timeout value in milliseconds used by our app to communicate with the server. Then we have a boolean value of GA_autoActivityTracking, which is currently set to true. This will allow us to auto-track the activities as this becomes available in our app. Next, there are 2 screen names declared. These are like an alias that will appear in our Google Analytics reports instead of the whole activity name. I will delete the second one as our app currently has one activity class called Highway Speed, and will rename the first screen name to the package and activity that will represent, in our case, com.cristiangredeșteanu.highwayspeed, followed by the activity name, which is also Highway Speed. And then we'll change the screen name from Analytics Sample Screen View to Highway Speed Screen View. This will be the name that will appear in our reports when this activity is tracked. Next, I will add one more element to this file. We have the option to extend the login capabilities of the Google Analytics component by specifying verbose as a log level for this component. This will be a string element, so I will change this accordingly. By doing this, we'll receive more detailed information in our log file coming from the Google Analytics component. That will help us to better debug the application. And last thing to include in this file, probably the most important one, is to declare our Google Analytics tracking ID. So back to my AdMob page, I will copy the app track ID from here and will paste it in the element GA_tracking ID of our configuration file. I will save the file, and before being able to test it, we need to include some code in the activities that we want to track. In our case, we have a single activity responsible for the game, which is highway speed. I will open the highwayspeed.java file, and inside the onCreate method, I will add my code. First, I need to obtain a reference to the tracker variable. We'll do this by declaring a new tracker object, giving its name as tracker, and we'll use the getTracker method declared in our application class to get a tracker instance. We have to use the proper casting in order to be able to call getTracker method. Now that we have a tracker variable, we can use it to communicate with Google Analytics server by sending hit events to it. In order to send an event to the Google Analytics server, we'll use the hitBuilder's event builder method along with the category and action parameters. I set the category to be game and the action to be starting game. But you can come up with something more useful when tracking the events that user is dealing with in your application. For example, you could use a category like purchasing, and action like buying credits, and a third argument called value, which will actually specify the amount of credits that the user is willing to purchase. In our example, I didn't use the value as this is an optional parameter. A category is the name that you supply as a way to group objects that you want to track. It is the first parameter used and it is required. The term action refers to the second parameter of the method and is also required. This will describe the action that the user is having within your app, like play button click, pause button click, and so on. And we end our method with the build function, which actually builds the request. We used the send method to actually send the data to the server. Alright, before running the app, let me check my Android manifest file to see if the newly application class has been added to it. And it seems that I need to add it manually, so I will type Android name equals and the name of my application class after the application element. That's it, time to run the application. I will press run and then we'll choose my Nexus 5 phone, which is already connected to the computer. There is not much to see on the screen regarding Google Analytics. All the data is transferred to the server in background, in a new thread. So by looking at the logcat window, we'll be able to tell if our implementation is working properly or not. In our logcat window, we can see something like GAV4. This is actually Google Analytics version 4, so our implementation is working so far, but the log also states no campaign data found, meaning that no data is to be transferred to the Google Analytics servers. We've set up our application to automatically track an activity of our game in the moment that this becomes visible on the screen. But in order to make this work, we need to add few more lines of code. I promise this will be short and after that we're all set. So back to our browser and opening another Google developer page, we can see that we need to include a global config resource in our manifest file if we want Google Analytics to automatically track and send this information to the server. So I will copy these 3 lines and will paste them inside the application node of my manifest file, not forgetting to modify the last line to point to my global_tracker file located in the XML folder. And the last step is to add the tracking methods to our activity. One that will get called when our activity starts and another one when our activity stops. I'll start by declaring the onStart function in my activity class because this is not already implemented. Inside this, we'll call the onStart method of our superclass and then we'll get the instance of our Google Analytics object. And we'll use the reportActivityStart method to track and send this action to the server. We'll do the same with the onStop method. We'll create this and add the same Google Analytics getInstance method to it, but this time we'll use the reportActivityStop method to notify the analytics server that our activity is no longer in foreground. And one last thing that I want to add to my configuration file is the option to suppress sending the actual data to the analytics server. You might want to do that in the debugging stages, so no actual data will be sent to the server, as this can interfere with the actual data sent by your users. You will still be able to see the requests in the logcat, but the data will not be passed to the server. Let's see how this works. I will again copy a boolean element of my configuration file and will paste it. Then I will change the name of the element to be ga_dry_run and will let its value as true. When dry run is set to true, the data will not be sent to the server. By default, dry run is set to false, so the data will be sent. Let's save the file and let's run the game one more time. Again, I will choose my Nexus 5 device, and this time if we take a look at our logcat, there are several messages generated by Google Analytics component of our app. The most important ones are following the putHit method call. This is the method that is sending the data or the hit to the server. Following that, we can see the actual data that is sent. The first lines are generated by the code contained in our onCreate method. We use the tracker_send function to send a hit to Google Analytics that include the game category along with the starting game action. These are all available here in the logs. And the second request is generated by the code contained in our onStart method, the one that will automatically send a hit to the server when the activity is started. We can see that highway speed screen view is sent here, and this is the alias that we used for this activity when we declare the screen name in our global tracker configuration file. It's also important to notice that the log states dry run enabled, hit not actually sent to service. So we enabled dry run to test the application without actually sending the data to the server or service. If we switch back to our browser and refresh our Google Analytics page, we can see that the data displayed here is still 0, so nothing was recorded. Let's get back to our configuration file and change the dry run element from true to false. This will allow us to actually send the data to the analytics server. Let's run the app one more time, and again we see the data in the logcat. But this time no dry run is specified, meaning that our data has actually been sent to the server. Now, if we switch back to our Google Analytics page and select Real Time and then Overview, we should see one active user. Still no active users yet, but you will have to be patient, as this could take between 1 and 4 minutes for the Google Analytics to display the real-time data, so we'll refresh the page in few moments. And after a few more seconds, the data is displayed in our Analytics account. We can see that one user is active in our application, the screen that has been tracked called Highway Speed Screen View, and even the version of the application used, which is 3.0. If we scroll down, we can even see the location of the user, which in this case is my town. From here, you can use all the Google Analytics views to display and analyze data in order to create a better app for your users. I hope that you enjoy the Analytics account page. You can see that the ID generated by AdMob is the same as the one that I'm using in my Analytics account to check for the user's activity in my game. Right now, there are no records available in my account because the game does not implement Google Analytics tracking at this time. In order to be able to AdMob ID, we also generated the app tracking ID for Google Analytics. This is the ID that we'll use to track our user interaction with our game. In case you didn't create a Google Analytics ID at that time, you can easily create one at any time from your Google Analytics account. And this is my Google to track the user interaction with my application or game. I will have to implement this into the game. To help us with this process, Google offers great support by describing the necessary steps in one of their developers page. So, before you begin, you need to make sure that you have the latest Android SDK installed. Hello! In this lesson, we'll discuss about adding Google Analytics to your game. This will allow you to track and optimize user experience. You can get an idea of how the users are interacting with your game and what are the aspects that you can improve to increase the user engagement with it. In a previous lesson, when we created our we already have that because we installed it in a previous lesson. Next step is to initialize the trackers. These are the objects that will keep track of our user presence and interaction with our app. And finally, we need to create at least one Google Analytics property and app view profile which will receive the